The sea stretched endlessly in all directions, an unbroken expanse of cold, dark water. The ferry rocked violently as it neared the island, the waves slapping against its rusted hull. I gripped the rail, my knuckles white, as the silhouette of the lighthouse loomed closer, its beacon slicing through the fog like a spectral eye. I had taken this job out of desperation. Life on the mainland had grown unbearable, and when I saw the ad, lighthouse keeper needed, remote location, I pay, it felt like a lifeline. The details were sparse, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. The idea of solitude, of complete separation from the chaos of the world, seemed almost appealing. The ferry captain, an older man with withered skin and a permanent scowl, gave me a hard look as he cut the engine. "You sure about this, kid?" His voice was rough, like gravel being ground beneath a boot. "Ain't many last long out here." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'll be fine." He muttered something under his breath, then motioned for me to disembark. I grabbed my duffel bag and stepped onto the dock, the wood creaking ominously beneath my weight. The air was thick with the scent of salt and something else, something metallic, like rust or old blood. A man waited for me at the end of the dock. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale against the black coat he wore. "You are the new keeper?" "Yes," I replied. "My name's Daniel." He didn't offer his own name. Instead, he turned sharply on his heel and began walking toward the lighthouse. "Follow me." I hesitated but obeyed, my boots crunching against the damp gravel path. The lighthouse loomed ahead, taller than I had imagined, its white paint peeling in long, jagged strips. The windows were dark, like empty sockets staring into the void. Inside, the air was musty, the scent of oil and damp stone lingering in every corner. The man led me up a narrow staircase to a small, sparsely furnished room. A single bed, a desk, and a rusted stove were the only comforts provided. A heavy logbook sat on the desk, its pages yellowed with age. "This will be your quarters," the man said. "You'll find everything you need." I set my bag down, glancing around. What exactly does the job entail? Keep the light on. Every night, without fail. His expression was unreadable. And follow the rules. He handed me a small, weathered notebook. The cover was cracked leather, the pages filled with spidery handwriting. My fingers trembled slightly as I flipped through it. Rules for the lighthouse keeper. The light must never go out. Do not open the door after midnight. If you hear knocking from inside the walls, do not investigate. Never acknowledge the figure in the fog. The logbook must be updated every morning. Do not descend into the lower levels. I looked up, confused. What is this? The man's expression darkened. It's for your safety. I let out a nervous chuckle. This is some kind of joke, right? His silence was answer enough. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving me alone with the weight of the rules pressing against my chest. That night, as the wind howled outside and the waves battered the rocks below, I sat beside the logbook, staring at the flickering glow of the lamp. The lighthouse creaked and groaned, the sounds of shifting wood and settling stone filling the empty space around me. Then, just past midnight, came the first knock from inside the walls. The knock was soft at first, almost imperceptible beneath the howling wind and the crashing waves. I told myself it was just the old structure settling, the wood expanding and contracting in the damp night air. But then it came again, 3 slow, deliberate raps against the inside of the wall. I held my breath, staring at the worn wooden planks. The lantern on my desk flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally along the walls. My fingers tightened around the edge of the desk, my mind racing through the list of rules I had read just hours ago. Rule number 3. If you hear knocking from inside the walls, do not investigate. A chill crawled up my spine, but I forced myself to stay still. I had no intention of breaking the rules my first night here. But sleep would not come easily after that. Every creak and groan of the lighthouse felt amplified, every whisper of wind outside a possible warning. By the time the first light of dawn bled into the sky, my body was exhausted, but my mind was sharper than ever. I dragged myself to the logbook, my fingers stiff as I flipped open its thick, yellow pages. The previous entries were meticulous, detailing wind speeds, wave patterns, and minor maintenance reports. Nothing unusual. Nothing that hinted at whatever had knocked in the night. I wrote my first entry, keeping it simple. January 12th, 5:42 a.m. First night on duty. The light remained on. Heard knocking from inside the walls. Did not investigate. As I set the pen down, something caught my eye, a smudge of ink on the very last page of the logbook, one that hadn't been there before. I turned to it, my breath catching in my throat. The ink was fresh, the words hastily scrawled. Do not trust the fog. I slammed the book shut, my pulse pounding. Who had written that? The last keeper? But why would they write it here, on a page they never intended to submit? A warning for the next person? For me? Shoving the uneasy thought aside, I decided to explore the lighthouse in daylight. The interior was old but sturdy, the stairwell winding up toward the beacon. Rusting oil cans and broken tools were scattered in the supply closet near the entrance, along with spare bulbs and a thick maintenance manual. But the lower levels, where rule number 6 warned me never to go, were locked with an iron chain that looked far newer than the rest of the building. As the day dragged on, I tried to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Shadows moved oddly along the walls, stretching and twisting in ways that didn't align with the sunlight outside. More than once, I turned, convinced I would find someone standing just out of sight, but the rooms remained empty. By nightfall, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the island whole. The ocean, the dock, even the small generator shed near the lighthouse's base, all of it vanished behind a dense, swirling gray. The beacon's light pulsed steadily above, a lonely eye cutting through the void. I stepped outside briefly, the cold mist curling around me, clinging to my skin like fingers. A noise drifted from the fog, something distant, yet eerily close. It wasn't the wind, nor the waves. It sounded almost human. A voice. Low, whispering, unintelligible at first. Then, clearer. Help me. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing on the damp stone. The voice had come from somewhere deep in the fog, just beyond my sight. My mind screamed at me to run, to get inside, to lock the door. Rule number 4, never acknowledge the figure in the fog. I turned, forcing myself to keep my eyes on the lighthouse, on the warmth of the doorway. I stepped inside, bolting the door behind me. My breathing was ragged, my heart hammering against my ribs. The fog pressed against the windows, swirling unnaturally, almost watching. And then, from somewhere within the lighthouse, came the knocking again. This time, it was louder. The knocking continued, relentless and deliberate. Each strike against the wall sent a shiver through my bones, reverberating in the empty lighthouse. I pressed my hands over my ears, willing it to stop, but the sound burrowed into my skull like a parasite. Then, suddenly, silence. I exhaled shakily, my body stiff from tension. The fog outside pressed against the windows, a dense wall of shifting gray that seemed almost alive. I knew better than to look too long. The rules were clear. I forced myself to move, to focus on something tangible. The logbook sat open on my desk, the ink of my previous entry barely dry. My fingers trembled as I wrote. January 13th, 6:04 a.m. The knocking returned, louder this time. Something called from the fog. I did not answer. I hesitated before adding, "The rules are real." My stomach twisted at the admission. When I first arrived, I had assumed the rules were nothing more than remnants of superstition left behind by lonely, paranoid keepers. Now, I wasn't so sure. I spent the morning searching for any sign of intrusion. Every door was still locked, every window latched. And yet, an unsettling awareness lingered, like someone had been standing just behind me all night, watching. It wasn't until I descended to the supply room that I noticed something out of place. A book. It lay on the floor, its spine cracked and pages yellowed with age. I picked it up, brushing away a layer of dust. The cover was worn, but the title was still visible. Log of Keeper Samuel Wright. The name prickled at my memory. I had skimmed the list of previous keepers before arriving, and Wright had been among them. But I had been told he left the post years ago. I sat on the cold stone floor, flipping through the brittle pages. His handwriting was tight and hurried, growing messier as the entries progressed. The early logs were standard weather patterns, maintenance notes, routine observations. Then, the tone shifted. The knocking started again last night. Louder this time. Closer. January 5th. The fog is worse than usual. I swear I saw something moving in it. Not a boat. Not a bird. January 7th. I heard the voice. It knew my name. My breath hitched. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages, skimming feverishly. January 9th. I broke the rule. I answered it. The next page was torn out. The entry after that was barely legible, the ink smudged and erratic. It's inside now. I snapped the book shut, my pulse roaring in my ears. A wave of nausea crashed over me. Samuel Wright had been here before me. He had followed the rules until he hadn't. And then he disappeared. A sudden gust of wind howled through the lighthouse, rattling the windows. The fog outside thickened, swirling against the glass in unnatural patterns. I had to get out of that room. I stuffed the log into my pocket and bolted up the stairs 2 at a time. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the lantern room, throwing open the hatch to the outside balcony. The salt air burned my lungs, but I welcomed it. The sea stretched endlessly beyond the fog, a vast abyss of shifting black and gray. For a moment, I let myself believe I was safe up here. Then, movement. Something in the fog. A shape, indistinct, yet unmistakably human, standing just beyond the reach of the lighthouse's beam. My blood ran cold. It didn't move, didn't waver, just stood there, waiting. A memory surged through me, Samuel's log. I heard the voice. It knew my name. The wind carried a whisper to my ears, threading through the howling gale. Daniel. My name. I stumbled back, my spine pressing against the cold metal railing. The thing in the fog remained motionless. I clenched my eyes shut, gripping the railing so hard my knuckles ached. Do not acknowledge the figure in the fog. I forced myself to turn away, stepping back into the lantern room and locking the hatch. My heart slammed against my ribs as I backed against the wall, sinking to the floor. I didn't look outside again that night. Instead, I lay awake, Samuel Wright's log clutched in my hands, dreading the inevitable. The knock came again, this time from inside my room. The knock came again, sharp and deliberate, just inches from where I lay. I held my breath, gripping the logbook in my hands like a lifeline. The air in the room had grown thick, heavy with something unseen, something waiting. My mind screamed for me to stay still, to pretend I hadn't heard, but my body betrayed me. I turned my head. The door to my quarters remained shut, the rusted lock intact. But the knocking had not come from the door. It had come from inside the room. A shiver crawled down my spine as I sat up slowly, my eyes scanning the dimly lit space. The lantern on my desk flickered as if disturbed by an unseen breath. The walls groaned, the floor creaked, but nothing moved. Yet I wasn't alone. I could feel it, pressing against my skin like a phantom touch. I squeezed my eyes shut, the words of the rules echoing in my head. Rule number 3, if you hear knocking from inside the walls, do not investigate. But how could I not? It wasn't just the walls anymore. It was here. With me. My fingers trembled as I reached for the lantern, its weak glow barely pushing back the shadows. Then, the whisper came, low and ragged, slipping through the air like a draft through a broken window. Daniel. My name. It knew my name. I bolted upright, my chair scraping against the floor. The whisper had come from the far corner of the room, where a heavy wooden wardrobe stood, its doors slightly ajar. The space beyond was black, and possibly deep, as though it led somewhere far beyond the confines of the lighthouse. I had 2 choices, follow the rules or find out what was lurking in the darkness. Some primal part of me screamed to run, to flee this cursed island and never look back. But the other part, the foolish, desperate part, demanded answers. My feet moved before my mind could stop them. Step by step, I approached the wardrobe, my pulse hammering in my ears. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of damp wood and salt. My fingers brushed the door's edge. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from within the wardrobe, something exhaled. I yanked the door open. Darkness. Deeper than the night sky, deeper than the ocean below. A void, endless and yawning. And in that void, eyes. A dozen of them, blinking in unison, their pale irises reflecting the lantern light. My breath hitched, a primal terror rooting me to the spot. The thing inside shifted, and the air around me turned frigid, sharp like needles against my skin. I stumbled backward, knocking over the lantern. The light sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness. A sound, low and guttural, rose from the wardrobe, a noise like laughter distorted through a broken radio. Then the whisper returned, closer this time. You broke the rule. I scrambled for the door, my hands fumbling with the lock. My fingers were numb, shaking too hard to grasp the handle. The wardrobe groaned as something inside began to move, its form slithering forward, unseen but unmistakably there. With a final, desperate twist, the lock gave way. I stumbled into the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was thick with fog, seeping into the lighthouse like an invading tide. The walls pulsed, the entire structure groaning as if alive. I ran. Up the winding stairs, past the empty supply room, past the heavy iron chain sealing off the lower levels. The lighthouse trembled around me, the fog whispering secrets I dared not understand. My mind screamed for escape, but I knew there was nowhere to go. At last, I reached the lantern room. The great beacon spun in slow, methodical circles, its light piercing the dense fog. I pressed myself against the glass, my chest heaving. Below, the island was gone, swallowed by the mist. And then I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing at the edge of the fog. Their forms were indistinct, shifting with the mist, but I could feel their eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. One figure stepped forward. Taller than the rest, its face obscured by the swirling gray. But I knew who it was before it even spoke. Samuel Wright. The last keeper. The one who had broken the rules before me. His voice reached me, distant yet deafening. You let it in. I pressed my hands against the glass, my body trembling. What is it? What's in the lighthouse? Samuel didn't answer. He only lifted his hand, pointing toward the stairwell behind me. The meaning was clear. It wasn't outside that I had to fear. It was inside. A soft creak sounded from below. A footstep on the stairs. I turned slowly, my breath hitching in my throat. Something was coming up the stairs. And it knew my name. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Each creak of the stairs echoed through the lighthouse, an invasive sound that burrowed deep into my skull. I pressed myself against the lantern room's glass, my breath fogging up the surface as I stared down at the swirling mist below. The figures remained at the edge of the fog, their blurred forms unmoving, watching. Waiting. I turned back toward the stairwell. The air had grown thick, heavy with something unseen but palpable. My pulse thundered in my ears. I should have listened to the rules. I should never have opened that wardrobe. But it was too late now. The footsteps stopped just beyond my line of sight. The air seemed to hum, vibrating like the strings of an unseen instrument. Then, Daniel. The voice was wrong. It had my mother's tone, her soft lilt, but it was hollow, stretched thin like it had been passed through a broken radio. My stomach twisted. My mother was thousands of miles away. I gripped the lantern room's railing, my knuckles white. You're not real. Silence. Then another step. The rules. Never acknowledge the voices. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing on the rhythmic sweep of the beacon's light. If I followed the rules, maybe it would go away. Maybe. The whisper came from directly behind me. "Daniel, please." I spun, expecting to see the empty stairwell. Instead, I saw movement, something shifting in the dim glow of the lighthouse's rotating beam. A shape. Too tall, too thin, its form flickering like a badly spliced film reel. It took a step closer. I stumbled backward, my hand fumbling for anything to use as a weapon. My fingers closed around the logbook I had stolen from the supply room, the one belonging to Samuel Wright. I flipped it open, desperate for anything that could help me. The pages were worn, some stained with what I prayed was just ink. My eyes darted over frantic, looping scrolls. January 10th. It knows my name. January 11th. The fog is inside now. January 12th. I see them in my dreams. They whisper the rules backwards. January 13th. There is no way out. My throat tightened. Samuel had been trapped, just as I was now. And then, I turned the page, and there, written in bold, desperate strokes, was a final message. The basement. I barely had time to process the meaning before the thing in the stairwell moved. A jerk, an unnatural twist of limbs, and then it lunged. I ran. Down the stairs, two at a time. The air shifted around me, thick with unseen hands reaching, grasping. I slammed into the walls, my balance barely holding as I spiraled downward. The knocking returned, rapid and frantic, pounding from inside the walls as though something was desperate to get out. I reached the locked door at the bottom of the lighthouse, the one chained shut, the one the rules forbade me from opening. Behind me, the footsteps returned, faster now. More of them. I yanked at the chain. Rust flaked against my fingers. The lock was old, corroded with time, but it held firm. I searched frantically for a key, for anything to pry it open. A whisper slid against my ear, impossibly close. "You don't belong here." I turned, my back against the door. The figures had followed me down, their shapes flickering in and out of focus, surrounding me. Their mouths moved, but no words came out, only the sound of the sea crashing against invisible shores. Then, as if guided by something unseen, my hand drifted to my pocket. The lighthouse keeper's key, the one I had never used. My fingers closed around it. I shoved it into the lock. The chain dropped away. The basement door creaked open, revealing a darkness deeper than anything I had ever known. And then something pulled me inside.